Let's go to our panel now. In London is counter-terrorism specialist David Otto, and in Drammen, Norway is Stig Jarle Hansen. He's the author of Al-shabab in Somalia, the history and ideology of a militant Islamist group. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. David Otto, let me start with you. Horrible attack. Is it clear to you that it actually was Al-shabab?
Of course, this is very clear that it carries all the hallmarks of Al-shabab, especially when one considers that the Garissa University attack of 2015 and the Westgate, attack of 2013, which led to the death of about 67 people. Al-Shabab, when it carries out these kind of attacks, especially on hard targets, of course, there are a lot of civilian targets within this area, but this is a heavily fortified mall. When it carries out these kind of attacks, it would use 4 men, usually because they can fit into a vehicle. They would always use suicide tactics and AK-47. So this is exactly the kind of tactics that Al-Shabab would use. So there is no doubt that this is Al-Shabab as they claim it to be.
Yeah, Abdiaziz Abu Musab from Al-Shabab told Reuters, "We are behind the attack in Nairobi. The operation is going on." Stig, one of the things that David spoke about is the nature of the attack and also the target of the attack. Those are hallmarks of Al-Shabab. Tell me, Stig, about the target, why they would choose 14 Riverside and why it would be so important to them.
No, I think, as was said by the previous speaker, that this is rather typical. 4 to 6 men. We are talking about targeting hotels. That's also very typical. Starting the attack with a suicide bomber. In the case of Kenya, targeting a hotel in an area where there's a lot of foreigners. I think essential in this planning is to try to hurt the Kenyans, who are relatively dependent on the tourist industry. This creates uncertainty amongst some of the NGO workers that lives in that area, some of the press people that lives in that area, and some of the tourists that frequents to Kenya. And the foreign earnings generated by the tourism industry is very important in the Kenyan economy. So this is an attempt to hurt Kenya where it really hurts. And that's not only in the casualties that we see, not only in the people that die in the attack, but also in the aftermath. One of the interesting things to watch now is to see the travel advices from the countries that goes to Kenya and to see now if there's travel warnings, and that might hurt Kenya.
David, tactically on the ground, it went on for hours and hours. Could the authorities have done better and stopped it quicker?
Well, of course, the Westgate Mall attack in 2013 went on for about 80 hours. This attack, comparatively, is an improvement in terms of the response from the security services. We could see that there were overwhelmingly different departments of security services on ground. But when you look at the impact of their presence, it sounds more like motion without movement. Because these are just 4 men, and what the security services have been able to do is that they've been on ground on time, but it seems as if the actual coordination in terms of how to actually reach onto these assailants, wasn't actually helpful because again it took them more than 10 or 12 hours to finally get hold of these assailants. And even until this morning, there were still gunshots being heard within the area. So yes, the response was swift, but there is more to learn by the Kenyan security services. Deploying all security services, civilians, was also a very dangerous tactics that could backfire because Al-Shabab could have easily deployed a secondary team, to infiltrate the security services that were on the ground.
And Stig, if you are the Kenyan government and you want to hit back, where do you fight them? Do you fight them in the forests between Kenya and Somalia? Do you fight them in urban centers where they might have different cells? Where do you actually find the enemy?
I would like to add and to disagree slightly with the previous speaker,
Sure.
though, because the target here was very complex. It's really hard to clear it out. And you can compare this with, for example, in the In Amenas attack in Algeria a couple of years ago. And it's actually hard to clear this compound. And I think the good thing about this attack was that it was much more coordinated. The reply from the Kenyan side was much more coordinated. I think, unfortunately for Kenya, the main battlefield in really defeating the Shabaab is inside Somalia. Basically, the Shabaab is taking advantage of a security vacuum in the Somali countryside and also of AMISOM that sometimes bunker up in bases and don't provide security for the local population in the countryside, enabling the Shabaab to pressure them for money and tax them. As long as this is not provided, as long as the Somalis themselves don't provide this, Shabaab is here for the long run. Unfortunately for Kenya, they have this long border towards Somalia, and it's going to be hard to stop them all the time. Kenya has improved, but it's hard to stop them, and this problem has to be solved internally in Somalia. And Kenya has made a great effort, I would say, but it's beyond Kenya. It has to be regional cooperation, and it has to be progress on the ground inside Somalia that solves the Shabaab issue.
David, do you agree with that? That no matter what Kenya does, fundamentally at the root of the problem is a Somali issue. Once Somalia is solved, Al-Shabaab will go away.
Of course, Somali is the, is the main source of Al-Shabaab. So therefore, it would be difficult for the Kenyans to solve this problem nationally without, helping Somalia to resolve the issue. Again, it is a regional collaboration because even if, Somalia was assisted in resolving the problem, and if Kenya or the other African regional members, Ethiopia and Uganda, if they do not have a national robust strategy, what would happen is Al-Shabaab will simply move from Somalia into other regions. So the key, as the gentleman rightly said, is an effective regional collaboration. But this has to be based on internal dynamics, because of course Al-Shabaab comes from Somalia, but you still have sleeper cells within Uganda, within Ethiopia, and within Kenya itself. So it has to be a two-stage approach, in that sense.
Stig, a lot of people use this theory when it comes to Daesh. Whenever there's a terror attack, they say, well, these are the death throes of the group because they're weak, so they're lashing out. Is that similar with Al-Shabaab? Is this a sign of strength or weakness? Is this the death throes or is it re-emergence?
I'm a little bit tired of the predictions of Shabaab's death because I've been working, studying the organization now since its inception. I've been studying it, in fact, since 2006. And each year you had this prediction of them dying. And I tell you now, they're not going to die. They're relatively stable. They're not on the increase. They're not on the decrease. They are stable. And as long as you don't bring security to the Somali countryside, it's not going to disappear in the future. They can stay there for the long duration. And as the gentleman before me said, there are fights to be taken inside Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and all these areas where Shabaab has networks. But there have actually been progress, and a lot of the recruitment channels of the Shabaab that they had in 2012, 2013 has been dismantled. There's still this youth, vulnerable youth in Kenya. There's still this poor youth who has idols in the Islamic State and has idols in the Shabaab. This problem hasn't been properly dealt with, but the Shabaab command lines has successfully been targeted. So this the Shabaab presence in Nairobi, I would say, it's much less now than it was, for example, 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah, let me pick up on one of those things then. David, has Kenya failed to address the fact that young men are still joining them?
Of course, before I even go through that point, I think one thing we have to understand is Al-Shabaab is not stable. In terms of its capacity, it has actually increased. If you look at the rate at which they are carrying out their attacks and the impact of these attacks, and in addition to that, Al-Shabaab, as well as other Boko Haram organizations, they are benefiting a lot from some of the returning foreign fighters that came from the ruins of Raqqa and Mosul. So that is why they're having much more experienced fighters and advised. So I don't think, they are declining in terms of their capacity. What they are doing now is much more dangerous than what they used to do in 2006, in the sense that most of their attacks are targeted against, very hard to, what we call hard targets, where, fortification and security services are attacked. So Kenya has to work on that. They have to work on their community strategy, because if you look at the dynamics of these attacks, it tells you that there has been an intensive planning and preparation by this group. They didn't just choose this particular place, out of, the blues. So the community has to understand how to report intelligence, and awareness as to, what these groups are carrying. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in Kenya, but more so, regional collaboration is important.
And Stig, who's collaborating with Al-Shabab? Who's helping them? Any groups?
I think Shabaab has its friends like Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula. These two organizations have been relatively close. But I also think that Shabaab is actually self-sustained. They gather a lot of money from taxation in the countryside, from checkpoints and from trade inside Somalia. And also they gather some support from various mosques alongside the East African coast. So they have a lot of income generating possibilities. Their close allies, as I said, used to be Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula, but both of these organizations are not able to support each other strategically. They can shelter each other, etc., discuss strategies, but huge support, moving of troops, that's impossible for them. I also think that Shabaab has declined slightly from 2012, but for the two last years, it has probably risen slightly again. I think it's actually an organization that is standing stable, and there are heavy indications that the strategies so far have curtailed them, but they are not enough to defeat them. And I also I'm worried about Kenya when it comes to the trust between the police and the common person in the street. That has been poor in the past, and this is a factor that needs to improve for the Kenyans to really hit down on these youth groups that so far the Shabaab hasn't really tapped into for the last 2 years, but they can tap into them in the future.
Yeah.
That's a danger that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, there was a really good Al Jazeera investigation a few years ago about alleged extrajudicial killings of especially ethnic Somali Kenyans in the country, and how that created some of the context for young people becoming radicalized. David Otto, innocent people killed, innocent guests to the country killed and injured. Do Kenyans have, I guess, a lot of cause for being really concerned right now that the Shabaab threat is greater or as great as it ever has been?
What the Kenyans would have to bear in mind is that the government has to be lucky all the times. Groups like Al-shabab, have to just be lucky once. In the words of the chief of IRA, Sean McStuffin, the Kenyans have to work in collaboration. And we talk about multi-agency approach led by the community. This is what Kenyans have to understand, because it is the ordinary citizens that suffer the most. They are the ones without the guns. They are the ones who have to run away the most when there is an attack. So I think what the government has to do is to assist them in terms of creating awareness, but also removing some of those, very easy drivers that would force people to collaborate and coordinate with some of these movements. Again, terrorist attacks are intelligence-led. So whoever gets the intelligence, gets the upper hand. The government has to work on that intelligence. They have to work with their communities in order for them to have a safer environment. Without that, Al-Shabaab would prosper. And, even if they carry out attacks once every 3 years, it is still bad for the government.
Right.
Even if the government reacts on time, it is still not good enough for those who have been killed.
David Otto and Stig Jarle Hansen, it's been good to have you both on the Newsmakers. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.